skier. Extreme skiers are the daredevils of the slope, out to push the envelope. They ski unmarked trails where most skiers would never think of going.
Before there was the X Games, freestyle skiing, or even snowboarding, extreme skiing was reserved for going fast and sending yourself off super tall cliffs. Having a feature part in a Warren Miller film was seen as the pinnacle of the sport starting in the 1970s and onward until the early 2000s. Many of the jumps I'll talk about next were featured in those films and are at least a small part of the reason these skiers pushed to jump cliffs as high as they did. Today we will look at the tragic history of the ski cliff jump world record. While the earliest cliff jumping records are lost to time, the first recorded ski drop was Todd McCoy in 1971 at Sun Valley, Idaho. Being around 50 feet in height, Todd chose an inverted type of fall, completing a front flip before landing on his back. This technique of landing on your back would become the generally accepted move as it provides a safer landing into the powder below. Over the next 10 years, the height record rose to the 80 to 90 foot range, but with more and more injuries occurring each year as skiers went higher, people weren't sure if the human body would be able to stand a 100-foot drop into snow. That certainly didn't stop some skiers from trying. Stepping up next to test that exact theory was one of the most iconic figures in the history of free skiing, Scott Schmidt. In several Warren Miller films, he was known as being the guy who just jumped off cliffs. Being different from earlier skiers who just hucked their bodies off the cliffs, Scott took a more controlled approach, hoping for a softer landing. Growing up in Helena, Montana, he moved to Squaw Valley in 1979, where he quickly grew the reputation of being the most daring skier, regularly practicing on cliffs ranging from 60 to 80 feet. Considered to be one of the very first professional steep skiers, he appeared in his first Warren Miller film in 1983 and collected a total of 8 credits on Miller's films over the course of his career. His most notable appearance was his second in 1984, when he jumped off a 100-foot cliff at the Palisades in Squaw Valley, claiming the cliff jump record for himself. During the last year of the 80s and into the 90s, the cliff drop record really began to heat up. Paul Ruff and John Trayman both had their eyes set on being atop the ski world. While filming for Warren Miller at Kirkwood Resort in California in 1989, John Trayman first set the official record at 105 feet. However, Paul Ruff was also filming that day, and just moments later, Ruff dropped the same cliff but left the edge 7 feet higher, claiming the record for himself at 112 feet. Taking the record only minutes after Trayman started one of the most heated rivalries in skiing history. As the 112-foot record stood for just under 2 years, Trayman planned non-stop for a much larger cliff the year after. Finally, in 1991, John Trayman stood atop Donner Summit in California. After checking with the safety team down below, he took a final deep breath and pushed off, skiing towards a cliff that stood 145 feet tall. As he leapt off the edge, it looked to be a perfect takeoff, and as he landed in the powder below, he skied off and rejoiced in reclaiming the record. In what was considered one of the most epic feats in ski history, this one jump led to tragedy for Paul Ruff. Feeling compelled to retake the world record and to cement his legacy, Paul Ruff felt one final jump could accomplish his goal and set him up for the rest of his life. Planning on jumping from a cliff of over 160 feet, he was told by his sponsors he could sell the footage of the jump for over $500,000 and retire from the game. Training for the next 2 years, it was on the morning of March 29, 1993, where he binded into his skis on top of the 160-foot cliff on Thimble Peak in the backcountry of Kirkwood, California. As he tried to dial in the takeoff point on the blind jump, his friends shouted from below that he should go higher. Not being a straight-down drop, it would require a significant amount of speed to clear the rocks at the base of the cliff. Meaning, instead of dropping straight down, Paul needed to jump out and across the distance to safely land over the rocks. As he set off for the jump, Paul did something no one understood right before takeoff. He readjusted his trajectory and checked his speed just a little bit. As he left the cliff's edge, it soon became horrifyingly clear to friends, photographers, and onlookers below that he didn't have enough speed. Leaning forward and beginning to flail in midair, Paul also knew he was coming up short on the rock shelf below. Landing on his back 10 feet short of the snow, he bounced 30 feet into the air. Tumbling to a rest, for a moment it seemed Paul may have dodged a bullet. When his friends reached him, he was unconscious but still breathing. He then woke up abruptly and sprung up stating, "Let me get up, I'm okay." Moments later, the color drained from his face and he collapsed. Paul suffered massive internal injuries, including several broken bones and a tear in his aorta. Even though rescue teams were on the scene within 10 minutes, by the end of the hour, Paul Ruff was dead. After the jump, many people believed it was too risky to replicate, that the payday was a pipe dream, and that Paul rolled the dice with his own life. Due to those facts, the record stood for another couple years. In the mid-1990s, a big mountain freeride skier from New Zealand named Paul Ahern put his name in the hat of the cliff drop world record. With a reputation of skiing away from crashes that would put most competitors in an ambulance, Ahern seemed to be strong enough to fight with the laws of physics. Having already dropped cliffs of over 100 feet, when he saw the video of John Trayman's 145-foot record, Ahern knew that with the right ski size and body positioning, he could go higher and land cleaner. Training for months, he began to drop several cliffs as morning warm-ups down in New Zealand, and worked his way up to feeling comfortable with the record. After years of practice, in Lake Alta in 1995, Paul and his team found the perfect cliff and setup for a record-breaking attempt. On the day of the jump, conditions were not ideal, and Paul couldn't get the death of rough out of his head. Remarking that he was scared as hell, he waited for over an hour for clouds and wind to clear, eventually stating it was now or never. One of the reasons for dropping this cliff was to prove it was possible, and to vindicate Paul Ruff, whose death he set out to prove was an error of technique rather than concept. The cliff he chose was 225 feet in height, and the landing was particularly flattish at 38 degrees. When he finally launched the cliff and landed in the snow below, those at the base of the cliff described his impact with the snow as spectacular. The freight train landing left him tender for weeks to come, but he did survive and broke the record. According to Paul, he was going about 80 miles per hour, and his first thoughts after landing were, "I'm never going to do this again." Having been suspected of breaking his sternum, he spent the night in the hospital doing x-rays, but they found out he was perfectly fine. Another legend in the historic skiing niche is Jamie Pierre. Undoubtedly an underrated skier, in 2006 he stepped up to a massive 255-foot cliff behind Grand Targhee Resort. 20 feet higher than the Golden Gate Bridge, it was estimated he reached terminal velocity just before landing on the ground. Slightly over-rotating by the time he landed, it wasn't an ideal landing as his upper back took much of the impact. Even so, the only injury he incurred was a cut to his upper lip, and after a brief check by his crew who dug him out, he eventually skied off. The last entry into the cliff jumping record books is Fred Searson, who during filming a warm-up run in the Alps for a 2008 movie, made a wrong turn and sent off a 352-foot cliff. Realizing at the last minute he was sending off a cliff, he made several life-saving decisions. Making a slight right-hand turn when sending off the cliff, it shortened his drop. Turning to his side in mid-air, he landed in a safer position and was then buried 10 feet deep in the powder. Being unconscious when his crew dug him up, he soon woke up and remarked, "I need to go back up there and try it again." Controversy remains if this counts as a true record, as he didn't intend to actually drop the cliff. Former record holder Paul Ahern is one of the biggest critics, as he insists he needs to go back up there and do it again. It's gotta be deliberate. That is the story of the ski cliff drop world record. What do you all think? Do you think the final jump should have counted? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to watch more scary, fascinating stories, please make sure to subscribe.